The doors of the church slammed open so hard the stained glass rattled in its frame, and every head in that sanctuary turned at once. I was standing at the altar, in white, my hands wrapped around a bouquet of magnolias, looking into the eyes of the only man who'd ever made me feel like poverty wasn't a permanent address. The pastor had just asked if anyone objected. I remember thinking it was a formality, a line in a script nobody ever answers. Somebody answered it. My name is Wendelin Dupree, though that day I was still just Wendelin. Soon to be married, soon to be humiliated in front of 200 witnesses who would talk about it for years. The woman standing in the doorway wore a cream-colored suit sharp enough to cut glass, and she didn't walk down that aisle so much as march it. Heels striking marble like gavel hits. "I disown you, Dave," she said, loud enough that the choir loft heard it, "for marrying a poor black single mother." Nobody moved. Not the groomsmen, not my own mother in the front pew with her hand pressed flat against her chest. Not even the pastor, who'd officiated 40 years of weddings and looked like he'd never once seen one go like this. Dave's hand went stiff in mine. I want to ask, if you're watching this and you've ever had someone try to humiliate you on what should have been the best day of your life, drop where you're watching from. I read every single comment. Lorene didn't wait for a response from anyone. She turned, heels striking marble again, and walked back out the same doors she'd come through, leaving them swinging on their hinges like the whole room was exhaling. Dave took one step after her, just one, then stopped, like his body remembered where he was standing and who was still holding his hand. "Go," I told him. My voice came out steadier than I expected. "If you need to go." "I don't." He turned back to me, jaw tight, eyes wet in a way I'd never seen on him before. "I don't need her." I didn't believe him. Not fully. Not yet. A man doesn't unlearn 28 years of a mother's voice in the time it takes her to walk out a church door. What none of those guests understood, what even I didn't fully understand until later, was that Lorene's anger never had anything to do with the color of my skin or the size of my bank account. She'd had a future picked out for her son since before I ever met him. A family with land. A bride from a name she could introduce at her church luncheons without flinching. I wasn't just unwelcome. I was the thing that broke her plan. The reception happened anyway. Smaller and quieter than planned, half the joy drained out of the room. Dave's uncle stood during the toasts and raised his glass toward an empty chair we'd left at the head table. The one meant for Dave's father. "To Thaddeus," he said, voice thick, "wish you were here to see your boy do something braver than you ever had the courage to do." Dave didn't explain it, and I didn't ask him to. Grief has its own timing, and that day already had enough wounds open. Later that night, in a hotel room 2 hours from the church, Dave held my face in both his hands, like he was trying to convince himself I was real. "We're never going to need her," he said. "Not for anything. Not ever." I nodded, because that's what you do when someone you love needs you to agree with them. But somewhere underneath the magnolias, still pinned in my hair, a small, quiet part of me wondered if a promise like that could survive 15 years of silence, or if it was already starting to crack the moment he said it. The phone rang 4 times before it went to voicemail, same as it had every night for 3 weeks straight. Dave sat on the edge of our bed with his elbows on his knees, staring at the screen like it might do something different this time. It never did. I watched him set it down gently, like the phone itself hadn't done anything wrong, like the problem was somewhere else entirely. "Maybe a letter," he said. "People read letters when they won't answer calls. So we wrote letters." I sat at our kitchen table, the one with the wobbly leg we'd propped up with a folded napkin. and helped him choose words that wouldn't sound like begging, even though that's exactly what it was. We mailed 3 of them over the course of a month. 2 came back unopened. The third just disappeared into silence, which somehow felt worse. We drove out to her house once, 45 minutes each way. Dave's hands tight on the wheel the whole drive, rehearsing what he'd say. She watched us from behind the curtain in her front window. Didn't open the door. Didn't turn the porch light on, even though it was getting dark by the time we pulled up. Dave's side of the family didn't treat me that way. His Aunt Pearline called every Sunday like clockwork, asking after my mother, asking what I was cooking, never once mentioning the wedding unless I brought it up first. His cousin sent a card with cash folded inside, no note attached, just a quiet kindness that said more than words could. That contrast sat heavy in my chest. It told me something Dave wasn't ready to hear yet. That this wasn't a misunderstanding waiting to be cleared up. This was a decision Lorene had made and intended to keep. It was Pearline who finally said it out loud, weeks later, over the phone while Dave was in the next room. She told her sister she'll never accept that woman, Pearline said, voice low like she hated being the one to carry it. Her words, Gwendolyn, not mine. I didn't tell Dave that part for 2 days. I didn't know how to hand him something that heavy without watching it break something in him. When I finally did, he didn't argue. He didn't defend her. He just sat very still for a long moment and something in his face changed, like a door quietly closing on its own hinges. No slamming required. I'm done, he said. I'm not calling anymore. I'm not driving out there. If she wants to find us, she knows exactly where we are. I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt the strange ache of watching someone give up on a parent, even one who didn't deserve to be held on to. We didn't speak about her again for a while after that. Life had a way of filling the silence. Bills, his new job, my shifts picking up at the agency I worked for back then. We were tired in the kind of way that made big feelings feel like a luxury we couldn't afford. Then, the same week Dave stopped reaching for that phone every night, I sat in our small bathroom staring at 2 pink lines that didn't waver no matter how many times I blinked. I didn't know yet whether to laugh or cry. I didn't know how I was going to tell a man who just buried his hope for a mother that he was about to become a father. I only knew one thing for certain. Whatever came next, we'd be building it without her. My daughter was 8 months old the first time I fell asleep standing up. I was holding her on my hip, bouncing her out of habit more than intention, while I waited for the bus that would take me to Mrs. Carroll's house for my evening shift. I worked for an agency back then, the kind that paid $11 an hour, and never once asked if the elderly clients I sat with were actually getting the care they were promised on paper. I started noticing the gaps before I had a name for them. Caregivers showing up late, or not at all. Families calling 3 different numbers just trying to find someone reliable to sit with their mother for 4 hours. I'd come home some nights and tell Dave about another missed shift, another family left scrambling, and somewhere in those conversations, an idea started taking root. I could do this better, I told him one night. Daughter asleep between us, dishes still in the sink. Not just the sitting, the whole thing, scheduling, matching the right people to the right families. Dave looked at me like I'd suggested we move to the moon. With what money, when? He wasn't wrong to ask. We had maybe $400 saved, a baby who went through diapers faster than we could buy them, and a landlord who didn't care about our dreams when rent was due on the 1st. But he didn't tell me no. He just kept working his warehouse job, kept coming home tired, kept watching me build something out of nothing at our kitchen table after our daughter went to sleep. The first few clients I found myself were unreliable in their own way. One family stopped paying after 3 weeks. Another expected me to work holidays for free because that's just what caregivers do. I learned fast that wanting to help people wasn't the same as knowing how to run something that could survive contact with the real world. What I did have, without ever planning for it, was the same instinct that got me through single motherhood before I ever met Dave. The ability to track a dozen moving pieces in my head at once and never let one of them drop. Appointment times, medication schedules, which client needed a calm voice and which one needed someone firm. I didn't call it logistics back then. I just called it surviving. The state licensure process nearly broke me. Forms returned for missing signatures. A liability insurance quote that made Dave go pale when I read it out loud. Months of waiting rooms and phone holds just to be told I was missing one more document. I almost quit twice. Dave talked me out of it both times, which felt strange given how unsure he'd been at the start. When the certification finally came through, I framed it. Not because it was beautiful. It was a plain government document, but because of what it meant. We were legitimate now. Insured. Accountable on paper, not just in my own head. I didn't expect anyone to notice that quickly. Over the next few weeks, 2 families I'd cared for recommended us to the discharge planners at the same regional hospital after their relatives were released. Those planners checked our new state license, asked around about our reliability, and eventually passed my number to their contracts coordinator. A few days later, my phone rang. The woman introduced herself as the contracts coordinator for the hospital network. "We don't usually reach out to agencies this new," she said, "but your name keeps coming up from families we've worked with. We'd like to meet and learn more about what you're building." I hung up and just stared at the phone. Dave looked over from the kitchen. "What happened?" I smiled so hard my cheeks hurt. "I think," I said, "someone finally noticed us." The contract sat on our kitchen table for 2 full days before either of us touched it. It wasn't long. 4 pages, standard language, a trial period before anything became permanent. But the number at the bottom of the staffing projection made my hands unsteady every time I picked it up. They wanted coverage across 30 homes, 30 families trusting us with their parents, their grandparents, the people they couldn't bear to lose. "I can't do this and keep the warehouse job," Dave said, not looking up from the page. "Something's got to go." We both knew what that meant. His paycheck was the floor under everything: the rent, the insurance, the formula. Walking away from it to chase something this fragile felt less like ambition and more like standing at the edge of a roof. He quit anyway. Gave his 2 weeks' notice on a Monday, came home that night with a look on his face like a man who'd just signed away his safety net on purpose. We hired 4 caregivers that first month. Real interviews, real background checks, real training sessions at our kitchen table, because we couldn't afford an office yet. I remember feeling proud watching Dave run those trainings, steady, patient, the kind of calm that made nervous new hires relax within minutes. That calm got tested fast. 3 weeks into the contract, one of our caregivers didn't show up for an overnight shift. No call, no text. Just an empty chair in a stranger's living room while an elderly man with dementia wandered his own hallway at 2 a.m, alone, until his daughter found him confused and frightened. The hospital network's coordinator called us at 6 the next morning. Her voice was flat in the way that scared me more than yelling would have. "This is exactly the kind of failure we can't have," she said. "We're reconsidering the contract." I felt the floor tilt under me. Everything we'd built, the licensure, the insurance, the trust we'd fought for, felt like it could collapse over one missed shift. Dave didn't panic. That's the part I still remember clearest. He asked for one meeting, in person, before any decision was made. He drove to the hospital administrator's office that same afternoon, sat across from her, and didn't make excuses. "We failed that family," he told her, plain as anything. Here's exactly what changed by this afternoon so it never happens again. He laid out a new on-call backup system, a tighter check-in protocol, a direct line to us personally for any missed shift alert. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't beg. He just stood in that failure and showed her a man who wasn't going to run from it. She extended the contract on a 90-day probation. That night, lying in bed, I told him I didn't know how he'd stayed so steady in that meeting. My hands had been shaking, just hearing about it secondhand. "Somebody had to be calm," he said. "You built the thing that got us here. I just had to keep it standing for one more day." I felt something settle between us that night that hadn't been there before. Not just love, but trust earned through fire, the kind that doesn't form when things go easy. 2 weeks later, the 90-day mark came and went without another incident. The contract became permanent. The following Tuesday, my cell phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. A second hospital network. This one twice the size of the first, asking if we had room to take on more. 4 years in, I finally stopped checking our business account balance like it might disappear overnight. We had an office now, a small storefront between a laundromat and a tax preparer, nothing fancy, but ours. 2 office staff helped with scheduling, and our caregiver roster had grown past 60 names. We'd expanded into a second county that spring, and for the first time since I'd started this thing at our kitchen table, I let myself believe it might actually last. Dave's family celebrated like we'd done something remarkable. Perline sent a card with a check inside, insisting it was just a little something for the new office, not a loan, never to be paid back. His cousins called wanting to know if we were hiring. Even his uncle, the one who'd toasted to Thaddeus at our wedding, drove 2 hours just to see the new space and stood in the doorway grinning like he'd built it himself. Lorene sent nothing, said nothing. By then, her silence wasn't a wound anymore. It was just weather, a condition we'd learned to plan around instead of waiting for it to change. Growth brought its own kind of trouble. A competitor 2 towns over started undercutting our rates that summer, offering families staffing at nearly half what we charged. 2 of our smaller contracts left within the same month, lured by numbers on a page instead of the people behind them. "They're going to bleed us out," Dave said one night, spreadsheet open in front of him, jaw tight in the way it got when he was scared and trying not to show it. I wasn't ready to panic. I'd seen what those bargain agencies actually delivered. Caregivers spread too thin, no real screening, turnover so high that clients barely learned a name before that person disappeared. The losses caught the attention of one hospital discharge coordinator who'd referred families to us for years. She asked to meet, not because we'd done anything wrong, but because she needed to know whether we were still stable enough to recommend. I told her the truth. We'd lost a few contracts. We hadn't lowered our standards, and we weren't going to. She thanked me for being honest. A week later, she referred 2 new families anyway. So instead of lowering prices, I started making calls. Not sales calls, personal ones. I called families we'd cared for over the years, just to ask how their parents were doing. I visited 2 longtime clients myself on my days off. One daughter looked at me with tears in her eyes after I'd stopped by to check on her father. "I've never had the owner of a company walk through my front door just to ask how my dad is doing," she told me. "That's why we're staying." Word traveled faster than any advertisement we could have afforded. One client, an elderly woman named Miss Odessa, put it plainer than I ever could when her daughter asked if she wanted to switch agencies to save money. "That girl who runs Wendelin's company calls me herself when something's wrong," she said. "You can't put a price on that." We didn't lose another contract that summer. 6 months later, one of the families who'd left for the cheaper agency asked if they could come back after missed visits, and constant caregiver turnover left them exhausted. I didn't gloat. I simply welcomed them back. By the end of the year, the bargain agency quietly closed its doors after losing several of its largest contracts to repeated staffing failures. I felt something shift in me during that stretch. Not just relief, but a kind of quiet confidence I hadn't let myself fully claim before. We weren't lucky. We'd built something people trusted enough to defend. It was a Thursday afternoon when a man in a gray suit walked into our newest facility, introduced himself as a regional scout for an investment group, and asked a string of quiet, careful questions about our growth numbers, our retention rates, our 5-year trajectory. He didn't say the words private equity outright. He didn't need to. I'd read enough business articles by then to recognize the shape of what he was circling. Before he left, he paused near the reception desk and looked back across the office where caregivers were arriving for afternoon assignments and phones rang with families calling by name instead of account number. He smiled to himself. "Companies like yours don't stay quiet for long," he said. "Somebody's going to come looking eventually." I watched him pull out of the parking lot and felt something settle low in my stomach. Not fear exactly, but the unmistakable sense that the quiet part of our story was ending. The first sign that we'd outgrown ourselves didn't come from a hospital. It came from inside our own office. The call arrived at 7 that morning, before I'd even finished my coffee. Our office manager sounded exhausted. "Gwendolyn," she said, "3 caregivers quit this morning." I was dressed and out the door within minutes. By the time I reached the office, the waiting room looked nothing like the calm little operation we'd built years earlier. Every phone was ringing. The scheduling board was covered with handwritten notes. 2 coordinators were trying to rearrange assignments while families kept calling, asking where their caregivers were. No emergency had happened. People were simply burning out. One caregiver had accepted a hospital position with better hours. Another had moved out of state. A third admitted she couldn't keep driving between counties anymore. For the first time since we'd opened, growth itself had become the problem. By lunchtime, we'd managed to cover every client using supervisors, part-time staff, and Dave himself stepping in to drive caregivers between locations. No patient missed care that day, but everyone inside the office looked like they'd run a marathon. That night, Dave stood in the kitchen staring at the whiteboard we'd started using to track staffing. "We're growing faster than we can support," he said quietly. He wasn't talking about money. He was talking about people. "We need stronger systems before we add anything else. Better scheduling, better recruiting, better training. Otherwise, we'll keep putting out fires every week." I understood exactly what he meant. I also knew something he didn't. The investment scout's visit months earlier hadn't left my mind. Companies our size didn't get ignored forever. Either we built the infrastructure to become something much bigger, or someone else would eventually build it and leave us behind. "Slowing down won't solve this," I said. "It'll just make us fight the same problems with fewer resources." He folded his arms. "You really think more growth fixes this?" "I think smarter growth does." He looked at me for a long moment. "You've been thinking about that investment group." I nodded. "They weren't interested because of who we are today. They were interested because of who they think we could become." Dave walked over to the whiteboard and studied it again. Rows of caregiver names, new counties we'd circled in red, open positions we hadn't been able to fill quickly enough. Finally, he uncapped a marker and drew a line across the board. "If we do this," he said, "we stop building like we're still running a small family business." Agreed. We hire people before we desperately need them. Agreed. We invest in better scheduling software. Agreed. And we don't expand unless the systems are ready first. I smiled. Now we're talking about building something that lasts. He stood there another few seconds before letting out a slow breath. For the first time in our marriage, I realized, He wasn't trying to protect the company from my ambition. He was helping shape it. The next morning, I opened my desk drawer and picked up the business card the man in the gray suit had left behind months earlier. He'd told me companies like ours didn't stay quiet for long. I finally called the number. By the end of the conversation, we'd scheduled a meeting for the following week to talk about what taking our company statewide would actually require, not just in ambition, but in systems strong enough to support it. 2 years after that meeting, I barely recognized my own calendar. What had been a handful of counties was now spread across the state, new offices opening every few months, new training sessions running back to back, new systems replacing the spreadsheets we used to build by hand at our kitchen table. We had hundreds of caregivers under contract by then, hundreds of families trusting us with the people they loved most. I should have felt triumphant every day. Some days I just felt tired. Dave and I passed each other more than we sat with each other that year. He'd come home from overseeing a new county launch right as I was leaving for an early meeting 2 hours away. Our daughter, old enough now to notice these things, asked me one evening why Daddy was always on the phone during dinner. I didn't have a good answer for her. The week after that, I missed one of her school programs because a staffing emergency pulled me halfway across the state. Dave recorded it on his phone so I could watch it later that night. I smiled through the video, then cried after everyone else had gone to bed. Building the company had given us opportunities we'd never imagined. But it was asking for pieces of us I hadn't expected to surrender. It was a Tuesday night, both of us finally home at the same time for once, when Dave said the thing I think had been sitting in him for months. "Are we building something?" he asked. "Or are we just running from something?" I knew exactly what he meant. We'd grown so fast, taken on so much that it had stopped feeling like ambition and started feeling like motion for the sake of motion. Like if we stopped moving, something might catch up to us. "Maybe both," I said. "Does it matter which? If it's working?" "It matters if we lose each other doing it," he said. Quiet, not angry, just honest in a way that scared me more than yelling would have. I sat down across from him at our table, older now, sturdier, no wobbly leg anymore. And I thought about that church 15 years before this conversation, the doors slamming open, the silence that followed. "You remember why we started this?" I said. "Not the money, not the growth charts. We started this so we'd never again have to stand somewhere depending on someone who could walk out and leave us with nothing." Dave didn't say anything for a moment. I watched something in his face soften, the exhaustion giving way to something steadier underneath it. "I remember," he said. "Then this isn't running," I told him. "This is making sure we never have to run again." He reached across the table and took my hand, and for the first time in months, it felt like we were standing on the same ground again instead of just orbiting the same house. We didn't solve everything that night. The hours stayed long. The stress didn't disappear because we'd had one honest conversation at a kitchen table. But something between us held steadier after that. A renewed sense that whatever this had become, we were still building it together, not just surviving it side by side. 3 weeks later, my office phone rang with a call I almost let go to voicemail, assuming it was another vendor pitch. It wasn't. The woman on the line introduced herself as a representative from one of the largest healthcare conglomerates in the country. She said they'd been watching our expansion for nearly a year, reviewing our performance across multiple counties, and wanted to know if Dave and I would be available for an introductory meeting about a potential acquisition. The conference room they flew us into had a view of the whole skyline, and I remember thinking how strange it was that a room this beautiful could make my stomach feel this unsettled. There were 6 of them across the table and just 2 of us. Lawyers in dark suits, accountants with laptops open, a senior executive who smiled in the practiced way of someone who'd done this 100 times before. Dave squeezed my hand once under the table before anyone said a word. The first few meetings felt like a courtship. Numbers we'd built from nothing suddenly mattered to people who managed billions. They asked about our retention rates, our licensure history, the systems I'd built at my kitchen table years before any of these people knew our names. For the first time, I let myself feel something close to pride sitting across from people that powerful. Then the lawyers came in, and the courtship turned into something colder. Due diligence meant strangers combing through every contract we'd ever signed, every dollar we'd ever spent, every decision I'd made when I was a single mother stitching this thing together out of desperation, not strategy. It was unsettling, watching people who'd never met a single one of our clients decide whether our life's work was worth what we believed it was worth. 3 weeks into the process, our lawyer called with a tone I didn't like. "There's a clause in their proposed structure," he said. "It restructures leadership post-acquisition. Dave stays on as an advisor. Wendellin's role gets folded into a regional oversight position. Lower title, less authority. A year-long transition before any real say in direction." I felt the floor tilt the way it had the morning of that missed shift years before. Except this time there was no clear villain to stand in front of. Just paperwork. Quietly deciding I'd built something too valuable to be trusted with running it myself. I didn't say anything for a long moment. Dave did. "That's not happening," he said to our lawyer, voice flat and certain in a way I hadn't heard from him since the day he sat across from that hospital administrator years ago. "She built this. If her name isn't protected at the top of this deal, there is no deal." "They may not move on this," our lawyer warned. "Then we walk," Dave said. "I mean that." I looked at him across our kitchen table that night. Older now, same wobble-free table, same 2 coffee mugs we'd had since before any of this started, and felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't expected to need so badly. Not gratitude, exactly. Something steadier than that. The plain, simple feeling of being seen by the one person whose opinion had always mattered most. "You don't have to fight this alone," he said, like he could hear what I hadn't said out loud. "I know," I told him. And for the first time in this entire process, I actually believed it. 2 days later, our lawyer called again, voice careful in the way that told me before he even said the words that something had shifted. "They've found an issue," he said. "Something in the original licensing structure from years ago. It's serious enough that it could stop this whole deal before it ever gets signed." The issue our lawyer warned us about turned out to be smaller than the panic it caused. But the panic itself nearly broke something between Dave and me before we ever fixed it. It went back to that early licensure paperwork, the same forms I'd fought through years ago at our kitchen table. One filing from our earliest expansion hadn't been documented exactly the way the acquiring company's compliance team preferred. It wasn't fraud. It wasn't illegal. But their lawyers wouldn't move forward until every question had been answered, and every supporting document matched the current structure. Our team had 72 hours before the acquisition committee met again. Dave and I sat up 2 nights straight, going through old documents, old contracts, old versions of ourselves captured in paperwork neither of us remembered signing in such detail. Every file box seemed to contain another reminder of how small we'd once been, and how little we'd imagined anyone would ever inspect those first years this closely. Tempers got short. At one point, Dave snapped at me for misplacing a folder, and I snapped right back that maybe he should have kept better records himself instead of trusting me to carry everything alone for years. We didn't speak for almost an hour after that. Just sat in the same room, sorting papers in silence, both of us too proud and too tired to apologize first. It was our daughter padding downstairs for water at midnight, who broke it without meaning to. "Are y'all okay?" she asked, half asleep, looking between us. Dave looked at me. I looked at him. Something in both our faces cracked open at the same time. "We're okay," he told her softly. "Go back to bed, baby." After she disappeared upstairs, he reached across the table and took my hand the same way he had in that conference room weeks earlier. "I'm sorry," he said. "This is breaking both of us a little. I don't want it to break us." "It won't," I told him. "Not if we keep choosing each other through it." By sunrise, our lawyers had supplied the missing documentation, and the compliance questions were satisfied. I thought the worst was behind us. It wasn't. The additional review triggered another requirement buried in the transaction documents. Years earlier, when we moved from our tiny storefront into our first real office, we'd accepted a small investment from a local businessman in exchange for a minority ownership stake. He'd believed in us long before anyone else did, and under the terms of that agreement, his approval was required before the sale could close. When he received the revised transaction documents, he worried the updated structure would reduce the value of what he'd spent years believing in. Instead of signing, he refused. Without his approval, the acquisition couldn't move forward. Dave didn't wait for lawyers to argue over emails. "I need to look him in the eye," he said. "Some things don't get solved over the phone." He booked a flight that afternoon. While he sat across from the investor in his office, I stayed home fielding calls from both legal teams, answering questions, supplying records, and trying to keep the momentum from slipping away. Every hour without an agreement felt heavier than the one before it. Late that evening, my phone finally rang. Dave sounded exhausted. "He wants one last call," he said. "Tonight, all of us. This decides everything." At 9 o'clock, we gathered on a conference call. The investor's voice was clipped and skeptical. He wasn't angry about the paperwork anymore. He simply wanted reassurance that the revised structure wouldn't dilute the ownership he'd held for years, or leave him carrying unexpected liability after closing. Once I understood that, the conversation changed. I proposed a revision protecting his existing equity through closing while leaving the acquiring company's terms untouched. Our lawyers confirmed the adjustment worked for everyone involved. Silence settled over the line. Nearly a full minute passed. Finally, he spoke. "Fine," he said quietly. "Send the paperwork tonight. I'll sign before midnight." The email arrived at 11:43. His signature was on the last page. For the first time in 3 days, I let myself breathe. The pen they handed me felt too light for what it was about to do. We signed in a different conference room this time, smaller, quieter, none of the early tension from those first meetings months before. $900 million, spread across documents stacked thick enough to need their own briefcase. Dave signed his name beside mine. And for a moment, neither of us said anything at all. I expected to feel triumphant. What I felt instead was strangely still, like the moment after a long storm when you're almost afraid to believe the quiet is real. When we stepped into the hallway, a handful of people who'd worked on the transaction were waiting outside. Our lawyer smiled first, then someone started clapping. It wasn't loud or theatrical. Just genuine. One by one, the others joined in, shaking our hands, congratulating us on building something most businesses never become. One of the younger associates looked at me and said, "My grandmother's caregiver came through your company. She stayed with us until the very end." "Thank you." That stayed with me far longer than the numbers ever would. We didn't celebrate the way I think people expect you to. No champagne. No speeches. No expensive dinner waiting somewhere downtown. We drove home mostly in silence, Dave's hand resting on the console between us, both of us too overwhelmed to perform joy for each other, when the real thing felt so much quieter than that. It was later that night, sitting at our kitchen table with the briefcase of documents still unopened on the counter, that the first real disagreement of our new life surfaced. "We should be careful," Dave said. "People who get money fast lose it just as fast. I've seen it happen." "I'm not talking about losing it," I said. "I'm talking about finally being able to breathe. We can help people now, Dave. Really help them." "We can do both," he said. "Careful and generous aren't opposites." He wasn't wrong, and once the words settled, I let go of the edge in my voice. We weren't really arguing about money. We were two people who'd spent 15 years building something out of nothing, suddenly faced with more security than either of us had ever imagined, trying to figure out how to hold it without losing ourselves in it. I sat with that thought long after Dave went up to check on our daughter. 15 years ago, I'd stood at an altar in a borrowed tiara, watching a woman storm out of a church because she believed I'd ruined her son's future. I thought about that night in the hotel room after, Dave promising we'd never need her, me not fully believing him yet. We hadn't needed her, not once, not for a single piece of what we'd built. Not the licensure, not the first contract, not the long nights wondering if payroll would clear, not the conglomerate sitting 2 floors above a city skyline asking for my signature. Like my name actually meant something in rooms like that. I felt something in my chest loosen that had been tight since that wedding day. Not bitterness toward Lorene anymore. Just a quiet, settled peace. The kind that doesn't need anyone else's permission or apology to exist. Dave came back downstairs and found me still sitting there, document briefcase untouched, eyes wet in a way that had nothing to do with sadness. "You okay?" he asked, sitting beside me. "I'm better than okay," I told him. "I'm exactly where I was always supposed to end up." He didn't ask me to explain it further. He just put his arm around me, and we sat there together until the house went fully quiet. 2 days later, my phone buzzed with a notification from a local news outlet. By lunchtime, the story had spread far beyond our city. Other business outlets picked it up. Industry publications followed. Before either of us had said a single public word about the sale, our names were already traveling farther than we ever had. I opened one of the headlines and felt my stomach tighten the second I realized how many people had already seen it. I didn't know any of this when it was happening. I only learned the full shape of it much later, pieced together from people who'd been close enough to watch it unfold. But it matters to the rest of this story, so I'll tell it the way it was told to me. Lorene's marriage to Roscoe Pruitt had looked solid from the outside for years. Comfortable house, 2 cars, the kind of life she'd always believed she was entitled to. What she didn't know, or perhaps never wanted to know, was that Roscoe had gradually taken over every major financial decision in their marriage. He handled the investments, paid the bills, managed the accounts, and assured her everything was under control. Behind that confidence, he'd been quietly draining their joint savings for years, pouring money into fake investment opportunities and supporting a second life she knew nothing about. She found out on an ordinary Tuesday morning. The monthly bank statement arrived in the mail, and she opened it expecting nothing more dramatic than balancing the household bills. Instead, the checking account balance was tens of thousands of dollars lower than it should have been. Transfer after transfer carried names she didn't recognize. When she confronted Roscoe, he didn't deny it for long. Within weeks, the marriage had collapsed into lawyers, financial disclosures, and divorce filings. The divorce stripped away more than the marriage. After debts were divided, the house was sold, and what little remained was split under the settlement. Lorene found herself with far less than she'd spent years assuming would always be there. The moving truck carried away furniture she'd once insisted was irreplaceable. She stood in the doorway of a modest rented condo across town, watching strangers unload boxes into rooms that echoed when she spoke. There were no meaningful retirement accounts in her own name. No career to return to after years of letting Roscoe handle the finances while she focused on appearances. The life she'd assumed was permanent had quietly disappeared underneath her long, before she'd noticed the ground shifting. Her sister called one afternoon after hearing she'd moved. "Everything all right?" she asked. "Perfectly fine," Lorene answered without hesitation. "Just wanted something smaller." She told the same story to women from church who asked why they hadn't seen her lately, told neighbors she was simplifying her life, smiled through conversations she wanted to end as quickly as possible. The truth was simpler and harder to admit. She had nowhere to turn, and no one she'd allowed close enough over the years to turn to. I think about that sometimes, how isolation has a way of feeding itself. The more she pushed people away to protect her pride, the fewer people remained close enough to catch her when she actually needed catching. One evening, she sat alone in that rented condo eating a microwave dinner from a plastic tray, the television playing more for company than entertainment. Bills lay unopened on the coffee table beside her. She wasn't really watching until the local news cut to a business segment. A healthcare staffing company had just been acquired for $900 million. The camera showed two founders standing together outside a building that had clearly grown far beyond its beginnings. She almost looked away. Then, the lower third graphic appeared beneath the photograph. Dave and Gwendolyn Dupree. The fork slipped from her hand and landed against the plate with a sharp clatter. For the first time in 15 years, she stared at the television without blinking. This part, too, I only learned afterward, pieced together later from a conversation Marguerite felt guilty enough about to eventually tell me herself. After Lorene saw that news segment, she didn't call her sister. She didn't call Roscoe's old friends, the ones who might have known whether the report was real. She sat in that rented condo with the television still glowing in front of her, remote in one hand, the other pressed against her mouth like she could hold the shock inside. The name on the screen had not changed. Dave and Gwendolyn Dupree. Not just Dave. Both of us. That was the part Marguerite later said she believed cut deepest. Lorene had spent 15 years telling herself I was the mistake her son had made. Then there I was beside him, named as a founder, standing in front of a company worth more money than Lorene could even say out loud without hearing how far she had fallen. She muted the television and searched the company name on her phone. Article after article came up. Photos, interviews, a timeline of growth, mentions of the kitchen table where the business started, the hospital contracts, the statewide expansion. The acquisition number repeated in every headline like a bell she couldn't stop hearing. $900 million. For a long time, she didn't move. Then she called Marguerite Kendrick. Marguerite was a cousin on Thaddeus's side, the kind of relative who stayed close enough to hear family news but far enough away to miss the ugly truth underneath it. She had never been told the full story of that wedding. Not the words Lorene said, not the silence that followed, not the years Dave spent reaching toward a mother who kept refusing his hand. So when Lorene called, Marguerite had no reason to guard herself. "I saw something on the news," Lorene said, keeping her voice light, careful. "About Dave. Is that really him? The company?" Marguerite answered plainly. "That's him," she said. "Him and his wife built that whole thing from nothing. Started in their kitchen, if you can believe it. Sold it for almost $1 billion, Lorene. $1 billion. Lorene went quiet so long Marguerite pulled the phone from her ear to check whether the call had dropped. "Lorene." "I'm here," she said quickly. "Just surprised. I haven't kept up the way I should have." There was something in that answer Marguerite didn't like. A tightness. A little too much control. The kind of careful tone people use when they are not asking out of love, but calculating what the answer might be worth. "You and Dave still close?" Marguerite asked. Lorene gave a small laugh that didn't quite land. "Close enough," she said. You know how grown children are, busy lives. Marguerite didn't push. That was the part she regretted later. She told me she felt something was wrong, but because no one had trusted her with the whole history, she didn't know what warning she was standing inside. After they hung up, Lorene stayed seated with her phone in her lap. The condo was quiet except for the muted television flashing headlines she no longer needed to hear. On the coffee table were the bills she had been avoiding: rent, insurance, utilities, the kind of ordinary paper that becomes frightening when there is no money steady behind it. For the first time in years, she did the math honestly. What she had left, how long it would last, what would happen when it ran out. Then she opened her contacts and began to scroll. Names passed under her thumb, people she barely spoke to anymore, people who would ask too many questions before offering anything. Then she stopped on one name she had never deleted: Dave Dupree. 15 years of silence, and his number was still there. She had told herself it was an oversight, a forgotten entry, nothing deliberate. But sitting there in that rented condo with the life she had protected so proudly shrinking around her, she finally admitted the truth. Some part of her had always known a day might come when she would need him. Pride had carried her through the wedding, through the silence, through every chance she had to repair what she broke. Pride had cost her a son for 15 years, and she had paid that price without flinching. But pride doesn't pay rent, and pride doesn't refill an empty account. She stared at his number until the screen dimmed once, then lit it again with her thumb. Something cold and decided settled into her face where shame should have been. Then she pressed call. We were sitting in the living room, half watching something neither of us could name later, when Dave's phone rang with a number he hadn't seen in 15 years. I watched his face change before he even answered. Something in him recognized the digits before his mind caught up to why they mattered. "It's her," he said, voice low, phone still ringing in his hand. I didn't tell him what to do. I just watched him decide for himself, the way he'd decided so many things over the years we'd built this life together. He answered. "Hello?" There was a pause on the other end, long enough that I almost thought she'd hung up. Then her voice came through, clear and steady, like 15 years hadn't happened at all. "Dave, it's your mother." I watched him go rigid on the couch beside me, jaw tight, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. 15 years of silence collapsed into 3 words, and I could see him struggling to find his footing inside it. "Lorene," he said. Not Mom, just her name. Careful and flat. She didn't apologize. She didn't ask how he'd been, didn't ask about his wife or his daughter or the years she'd missed. She moved straight past all of it like none of it required acknowledgement. "I need a new apartment," she said. "And I'm going to need a car. A Range Rover. The autobiography, specifically." The silence that followed was the loudest thing I'd ever heard in our living room. Dave sat frozen, phone pressed to his ear, mouth slightly open like his body had simply stopped knowing what to do next. I watched him for 3 full seconds, waiting for him to find words. When none came, I reached over and gently took the phone from his hand. He let me. "Lorene," I said, voice calm, steady, nothing like the trembling bride she'd humiliated at that altar 15 years before. "This is Gwendolyn." I heard her breath catch slightly on the other end. "After our wedding, we called you. We texted you. We drove to your house. We stood on your porch while you watched us from behind a curtain and never opened the door. That went on for years, Lorene. Years of trying. You ignored every single one of them." "That's not why I'm calling," she started, voice tightening. "I know exactly why you're calling. I said. You saw the news. She didn't deny it. The silence on her end told me everything I needed to know. Then I said the only thing that mattered. 15 years ago, you disowned us. Today, we're simply respecting your decision. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I could hear it in the way her breathing changed on the other end of the line. Sharp, then careful, like she was trying to recover footing she hadn't realized she'd lost. Let me speak to my son, she said, voice thinner now, the entitlement cracking just slightly at the edges. This doesn't concern you. It concerns me completely, I said, but I'll let him decide that for himself. I looked at Dave, who was watching me with something between shock and quiet awe. I held the phone out to him and watched Lorene's name still glowing on the screen, waiting to see which one of us he'd choose to answer next. She started calling Dave's cell directly after that, always when she knew I'd likely be at work. Always careful never to dial during hours, we were usually together. He told me about each one. I'll give him that. He never hid them from me. Never let her calls become a secret between us. But I watched something in him soften a little more each time he hung up, an old guilt resurfacing that I thought we'd buried years before. She's not asking for anything this time, he told me after the third call. She just wants to talk. Says she misses her son. She misses what her son became, I said, not who he was when she walked out on him. He didn't argue, but he didn't fully agree either. I watched him sit with it, turning the same question over that he'd turned over 100 times in 15 years. How much do you owe a parent who only shows up once? There's something to gain. Lorene was careful in those calls, Dave told me later. She never mentioned the apartment again, never brought up the car. She talked instead about missing him, about regretting lost time, framing herself as a mother wounded by circumstance, rather than a woman who'd chosen silence for 15 years and only broken it the moment she needed something. She never asks about you, Dave admitted one night, almost like a confession. Not once. It's always just me. That's not an accident, I told him. That's the whole strategy. He wanted to believe there was something real underneath it. I understood why. No matter how she'd treated him, she was still the only mother he had, and some part of him had spent 15 years hoping the door might open again on different terms than the ones it had slammed shut on. The call that finally cracked something open in him came on a Sunday evening. Lorene's voice, softer than usual, slower, building toward something. Your father would be ashamed, she said, to see how far apart you've let us drift. Thaddeus always said family forgives. That's what he believed. Dave went very still on the phone. I watched his face from across the room, watched something shift behind his eyes, not softening this time, but sharpening. Don't, he said, voice low and even. Don't use him for this. I'm only saying what he would have wanted, Lorene pressed. You don't get to speak for him, Dave said. You weren't there for any of the years that would have told you what he wanted. I was. He hung up without raising his voice, set the phone down on the table, and sat there for a long moment in silence. She used him, he said finally, looking up at me. She actually used my own father against me. I didn't say anything. I let him sit inside that realization without rushing him through it. I'm done letting her control the terms, he said, voice steady now in a way I hadn't heard since the conglomerate's lawyers tried to push me out of my own company. If she wants any place in our lives, it's going to be on terms we set, not her. He picked the phone back up, scrolled to her name, and started typing instead of calling. Slow, deliberate, like a man finally writing the ending to something that should have ended 15 years ago. Dave called her one last time on his own terms, a week after he'd hung up on the conversation about his father. I wasn't in the room for that call. He asked to do this one alone, and I respected that enough to give him the space, busying myself in the kitchen while his voice carried low and even from the next room. "I'm not calling to argue," I heard him say. "I'm calling to tell you how this works going forward, if you want any place in our lives at all." I couldn't hear her responses, only the rhythm of his replies, calm, unhurried, nothing like the frozen silence that had taken him over the night she first called about the apartment and the car. "There's no apartment," he said at one point. "No car, nothing financial ever. That's not on the table and never will be." A pause. "And if you want to see me," he continued, "you respect my wife, not pretend to. Actually respect her, or you don't see me at all." I don't know exactly what she said back, but I heard him exhale slowly, the sound of a man holding steady against pressure he'd spent 15 years used to bending under. 2 days later, his lawyer sent her a written letter, formal, plain, leaving no room for confusion later, no claims to any part of the company, no financial expectations now or in the future, contact only on terms of basic respect, reviewed and revoked at Dave's discretion if that respect ever wavered. She resisted at first, Dave told me. Called the letter cold, said family didn't need contracts to prove love. He didn't argue the point. He simply told her the letter wasn't about love. It was about clarity, the kind neither of them had ever had with each other until money forced the conversation into the open. She signed it eventually. I think she understood, somewhere underneath the pride that still ran thick in her voice whenever Dave mentioned her, that she had no leverage left to negotiate from. No threat, no silence to weaponize, no upper hand to wait out. She still hasn't warmed to me. Dave visits her now, a few times a year, careful and limited, and she's polite enough on the rare occasions our paths cross, though something cold still sits behind her eyes when she looks at me. I don't need her to like me. I stopped needing that the moment I took the phone from Dave's hand and told her exactly where we stood. Some nights, when the house is quiet and our daughter is grown enough now to be out living her own life, I think back to that church, magnolias in my hair, Lorene's heels striking marble, the silence that followed her storming out. I remember not believing Dave when he promised we'd never need her. He was right, in the end. We never did. What I've learned, sitting on the other side of everything we built without her, is that some people only show up once you've become impossible to ignore. Their love was never really love at all, just proximity to something they thought they were owed. I don't carry bitterness about it anymore, just a quiet, settled peace, the kind that doesn't ask anyone's permission to exist. We built a life loud enough to drown out everything she ever tried to take from us. And in the end, that was always going to be enough.